This is Q on CBC Radio 1 across Canada, Sirius Satellite, and PRI in the United States. Take a listen to this.
Do you know how many Oscars I've won? Do you know how many Golden Globes I've won? And I'd be like, gee, Harvey, do you know how many Boy Scout merit badges I have and an Emmy?
He's a tough guy with incredible taste.
He's a maverick.
He is absolutely 100% in that big Hollywood mogul tradition.
A modern showmanship, in a way, almost a little touch of the sensationalism of a DeMille.
I'd say 50% genius, 50% asshole.
I would think that the movie-making world would be a less interesting place if he's not a player in it.
There you go. Well, the Harvey in question is American film producer Harvey Weinstein, a former New Yorker turned Buffalo concert promoter. He's best known for co-founding Miramax Films in 1979 with his brother Bob. With unexpected hits like Sex, Lies, and Videotape, Pulp Fiction, Sling Blade, Harvey Weinstein's movies have reshaped the American film landscape and scored 292 Oscar nominations and 67 awards in the process. And as depicted in the new documentary film Unauthorized, the Harvey Weinstein Project, he is also a polarizing figure, fearless about butting heads with staff, filmmakers, and the Hollywood studios. Well, in keeping with his reputation, if Harvey Weinstein had his way, the film Unauthorized, the Harvey Weinstein Project, would not exist. But that didn't discourage my next guest from making it. Barry Avrich is a Canadian filmmaker, producer, and marketing executive, and he is the director of Unauthorized, the Harvey Weinstein Project. And right now, Barry Avrich joins me in Studio Q. Hello, sir.
How are you?
Nice to see you again.
Good to see you.
You always come in with your compelling films. Look at you. I want to get into Harvey Weinstein's reservations about your film, because there must be an interesting story behind that. But first, a little context. The American film industry has had no shortage of controversial, larger-than-life figures. Where does Weinstein fit in?
First of all, I don't like to talk about my work. No, I'm just kidding. Of course, Billy Bob Thornton.
Yes.
Harvey paid the most money ever for an independent film when he picked up Sling Blade, $10 million, and I thought I'd 6 degrees it back to that for you.
Thank you, Barry. I appreciate it.
Well, Harvey Weinstein, is an extraordinary figure, because when you go back to the moguls of the day, Jack Warner, Harry Cohn, all Daryl Zanuck. These guys were huge moguls, but they weren't brands. Harvey Weinstein was really the first consumer brand.
What does that mean?
Well, people would open up the newspaper and say, I want to see a Miramax film, because it meant generally good, art, indie. Nobody picks up a newspaper and says, I want to see a Paramount film this weekend.
And by the way, before we get into the darker side or the difficulties of Harvey Weinstein, he is responsible for some of the most incredible films, some of my favorite films. First of all, starting with foreign films like Cinema Paradiso and Pele the Conqueror, and then into the kind of stuff like Pulp Fiction and so many of the indie greats that we love, right?
Well, that's the great dichotomy. And, in Harvey Weinstein, he was this 300-pound freight train of a man that comes through a meeting tearing phones out of walls and throwing computers at your head, and then has this magnificent taste to make sure films like My Left Foot and The English Patient happen. It is quite extraordinary.
When did you decide, and why, that you wanted to actually make a film about him?
I made a film in 2005 called The Last Mogul about Lew Wasserman. And when I interviewed people and I said, was Lew Wasserman, who of course ran Universal Studios for 6 decades in this major power, and I'd say to people, do you really think that Lew Wasserman is the last mogul? And some would definitively say, yes, he's the last mogul. And others would say, well, there's Harvey Weinstein. And so I parked that for a bit, and I contacted Harvey and said, I want to make this film about you. You're the follow-up to Lew Wasserman. And his response was, that's a great idea, and I'll let you know when I'm ready. You're the guy.
He still isn't ready, but you've made the film.
That's right.
Weinstein was a hugely successful concert promoter before starting Miramax Films. Miramax, by the way, is named after his parents, right? Miriam and Max.
That's correct.
He starts Miramax in 79 with his brother. He seemed to take those skills from being a concert promoter forward. Much of Miramax's early success wasn't so much based on releasing great films, but rather on how they released them. What was it that worked for Weinstein in that regard?
Well, again, going back to the concert days, he completely understood that you had to fill every seat. And he took that tactic and that strategy to the film business. And then it was really all about marketing. I mean, specifically, let's look at The Crying Game. This was a film that did not do well in England. Crazy story, and he came up with this brilliant idea. This is pre-internet, pre-blogging, pre-tweeting, to say, don't give away the shocking twist in the film. Keep it quiet. Don't give it away. And the media and the public went along with it, which was unbelievable. So you went to see The Crying Game to see what it was. It wasn't a particularly enthralling, fast-paced film, but it was all about the marketing. Same thing with Sex, Lies, and Videotape. First indie film that a company bought millions of dollars in television advertising for. Nobody did that. You ran a small little ad in the newspaper, and you hoped that word of mouth would pick it up.
There's two Weinsteins. There's Harvey and Bob. They
Yes.
work together. We know Harvey. We don't really know Bob as much. Harvey's the public figure. How does their partnership work?
Well, I think it's brilliant. I think somewhere along the way, Bob decided to be the man in the shadows who's sort of the business head. Somebody in the film says, Harvey's greed and Bob is business. Bob launched the Dimension label, films like Scary Movie and Scream and The Crow, films that made money. And often it was Dimension, Bob's label, that kept the business alive while Harvey was sometimes making films that were just major disasters.
And as Miramax slowly but steadily begins its rise into the 90s and then even into this decade, Harvey was gaining a reputation for being something of a bully and an intimidator. I mean, you really make the point through the people you interview who had all kinds of proximity to him. I mean, assistants who were reduced to tears, film producers, actors. This was a really difficult guy to work with. Why do people keep working with him?
Well, it's fun. It's amazing. Often you go back to a man that has the largest check. You go back to a man that believes in art, which he does. I mean, I have to tell this very, very fast story, but, James Ivory, the great director from Merchant Ivory, Room with a View, Howard's End, some of the greatest films, made this film, Mr. and Mrs. Bridge, with Harvey Weinstein. And Harvey insisted on cutting the film or attempting to try and cut the film. He bullied these boys around like crazy. And James Ivory said, I will never work with him again. And then out comes Shakespeare in Love, and James Ivory's, walking around town trying to get a film made without any luck. And he takes a subway down to Tribeca, walks into Harvey's office and shows him the script and says, all right, I'm back. And he goes back, and I said that to James Ivory. Why did you go back if he was such a horrible man? He goes, I don't know. And, and then he had the film was The Golden Bull, and they had a horrendous time on that again. They ended up buying the film back. They had a lot of money then.
But when Harvey Weinstein's getting involved in recutting films, ordering 9 minutes out of this, or let's edit this somehow, is that business for him, or does he consider himself an artist?
Well, Harvey Scissorhands, that's the great debate. When you buy a film and you own it, should you have the right to alter it? If you buy a painting by Picasso or whoever, should you have a right to paint over it and to alter the film?
And yet one of the journalists in your film says, when I file a story or an editorial, the editors of my paper still have the right to affect the copy, right?
Well, Harvey has an instinct in terms of marketing a film, and he's about to do the same with The King's Speech. There's a lot of controversy that he wants to cut The King's Speech down another 12 minutes to make it more palatable for a North American audience, which is, I think, quite amazing, because the film worked for me. But he's done this with Cinema Paradiso. He's done this with Sling Blade, and he does it generally quite well. He understands an instinct.
Well, there's filmmakers who testify that the cuts he demanded, which they originally argued against, actually improved their films, right?
Sling Blade's one of them. Yeah.
So he has the instincts.
He does have an instinct in terms of audience attention span and where a film drags. I remember sitting in a focus group with him, a research study on one of the films, and he would literally snap his fingers at moments where there should be cuts or where the audience was fidgeting. He knows film.
Miramax is credited with spurring on the indie film renaissance in the late 80s and early 90s with movies like the ones we've been talking about, Sex, Lies, and Videotape, The Crying Game, most famously Pulp Fiction. You argue in your doc that the success of these movies forever changed independent film. How so?
Well, it became the story again. This was an era of the blockbuster that Harvey came in at that time. Jaws and Star Wars, and I think what he ended up doing was making films accessible. You weren't, the general public wasn't necessarily going to run to see a subtitled film or obscure stories.
Making art films or indie films.
Making arts and indie films and getting people in there, bringing the audience into the theater to see them, and that suddenly created this massive audience for foreign film, indie film.
Some argue that he raised the stakes too high, though, for independent films. Suddenly, indie films become films that are bankrolled by $100 million. Was what he has done good for independent film?
Well, I think so. I mean, at the end of the day, the argument is, did he end up paying too much for indie film? $10 million for Sling Blade, $10 million for the film Happy Texas that didn't end up working. He raised the costs to market and to ultimately acquire these films, which I think hurt indie cinema and ended up spawning a million indie companies like Miramax. Most of them haven't worked.
Let's get to your cojones for deciding to forge ahead with this film, because you make no shortage of give us no shortage of evidence in the film that this is a powerful guy who can make and break people in the business. But you decide to go ahead with this film, even though this is an unauthorized documentary. Harvey Weinstein personally advised you not to make this film. What were his concerns?
Well, I think you have to understand something. My background is marketing. I've marketed thousands of films. I worked on marketing Miramax's films in Canada for 15 years. So I've seen him. I know him. He doesn't quite know what to make of me in terms of the fact that I was going to go ahead with this. I think ultimately his concerns were, like anybody else, is that he does not have final cut. How was I going to perceive him? When we met the night before the Oscars last year, and he said, "What are you going to say? I'm 50% asshole, 50% genius, as you heard in the film. So what?" And I said, "Well, that's an incredible story." And he would come up with tens and dozens of other people that I should make films about, but he didn't want me to go ahead. But ultimately because he wouldn't have final cut.
Well, you end up getting a lot of big names in this film, including Scorsese, Marty Scorsese, George Hickenlooper, the filmmaker, who's very open about his issues with Harvey Weinstein. Writer John Irving. To your knowledge, did Harvey Weinstein discourage people from cooperating in your film?
To my knowledge, I can bring in a telephone book of names of people that he would call and say, "Don't get involved." People that would call him and say, "Listen, I'm thinking of doing Barry's film," and he'd give them. It was never forceful. It would be, "Well, my friends aren't participating," things like that. And the last conversation that we had, we continue this bizarre email relationship. The last conversation I had was, he said, "Well, all right, you go ahead with this, but on Monday morning, I'm showing up at your door with a film crew and making a film about you." I said, "Great."
But so why would people like Scorsese do it? Why did they tell you that they would agree to do your film?
I think we live, Hollywood's a world where, you never know. And I think there's been so much difficulties in Scorsese and Harvey's relationship, specifically on the film The Gangs of New York, where they fought and then again went back. Marty went back and did The Aviator. I think Marty wanted to set the record straight and say nice things about him, although you can see in the interview he's very, very restrained.
He's a powerful and influential figure, Harvey Weinstein. Do you have concerns? This is career or suicide for you to make this documentary?
No worries. No, I'm just kidding. No, the one newspaper out of Australia had a headline that this must be career suicide in making this film. I heard the same thing with The Last Mogul. I don't think an American could have made the film. I think people would have been too nervous to take him on.
It makes a difference that you're Canadian.
100%. 100%. And
you're still operating in the same entertainment business, aren't you?
I am, but I've got my sort of rep for making these films about Hollywood figures. They're very, very fair. They're even-handed. They're not true Hollywood story hatchet jobs. I'm not talking about Harvey's family or his wives or anything. And so they're balanced films. I as I said to Harvey as we sat there last year, I said, if you have any concerns once this film comes out, I'll be completely shocked.
The Weinstein brothers are no longer with Miramax. They started a new company simply called the Weinstein Company. It hasn't been as successful as Miramax was in its heyday. Do you think if his career was at a more upbeat point right now, he would be more welcoming to a documentary being made about him?
Well, he did say to me, wait, there's another act here. And with Harvey, as you chase the story and you keep editing and changing things, it does completely evolve on a daily basis. I think, Jean, the point is that, he starts the Weinstein Company, has a lot of films that don't do well, and then surprises everybody roaring back with Inglourious Bastards. And here he is dominating the story again with The King's Speech versus Social Network.
He'll probably be on stage again, right, at the Oscars? If the King's... he likes to go on stage when his films win?
Absolutely. If The Fighter won, it would be a different story because, it isn't his film. He picked it up. The King's Speech, I think he will definitely be on that stage. And it's going to be fascinating to watch because it takes you back to the big battle between Shakespeare in Love and Saving Private Ryan, where no one expected Shakespeare in Love to work. And that's at that point where Harvey redefined the Oscar rules.
Throughout the film, he's characterized as both a monster and a genius. Ultimately, how do you see him?
As a monster and a genius. He's listen. You grow up working for moguls, and I've worked with all the Canadian ones, and you understand that the screaming and the yelling is performance. It isn't personal, and Harvey is over the top. Old mogul tradition of screaming and yelling and demanding perfection and being difficult, and that's part of the the art and the madness of Harvey Weinstein.
I've said it. I said it earlier. It is a compelling documentary.
Thank you.
Congrats to you, and thanks very much for taking the time to come in here and having the fortitude to forge ahead with this doc.
My pleasure.
That's filmmaker Barry Avrich. His new film is called Unauthorized: The Harvey Weinstein Project, and Barry Avrich has been with me here in Studio Q.